Now, we saw in chapter 6 that some of the folks in Corinth were really holding on to this idea that was prevalent in the ancient world, this idea that we term in theology called Gnosticism. Everybody say Gnosticism. Gnosticism means I separate my physical life from my spiritual life. And God doesn't care what I do in my physical life. All he cares about is my spiritual life. And Paul spent chapter 6 trying to say, no, asceticism isn't right. When you gave Jesus your life, you gave him all, and he wants you to glorify God in your body. Well, the other end of the pendulum from Gnosticism is this idea that we call asceticism. Say asceticism. Asceticism is the idea that I want to be 1,000% committed to God, and I am going to forsake everything in the physical world. I'm not going to wear makeup. I'm not going to do my hair. I'm going to dress very simply. I'm even going to forsake relationships for the sake of my devotion to God. Throughout history, we've seen movements like monks who leave everything and they go to a deserted place and they live in a monastery where they can just read their Bibles and pray and study, and they forsake everything else in life because they just want to be 1,000% pure and committed to Jesus. And that's a good idea, but taken to an extreme leads to legalism. And unfortunately, some of the folks in Corinth had swung the pendulum as first-generation Christians that far. And especially when it comes to marriage and family. It's interesting, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1, let's look at the first topic that Paul is going to respond to. And it says in verse 1, now concerning the things about which you wrote. So here's one of them. It is good for a man to not touch a what? A who. I'm sorry. Women aren't whats. A who. Now, we don't know if this is Paul's summary of their question, because maybe their question concluded, Paul, we think it's not good to have any kind of relationships, especially physical intimacy relationships, because we just want to be pure. And that kind of stuff is it pure? Or is this statement the summary of Paul's answer? Paul's going to conclude, you know what, it's better to stay single than it is to get married. But whichever one, Paul is going to answer the question about physical relationships, specifically marriage and family. When it comes to my devotion to God, where does my marriage and where do my family fit in? Now, in order to understand this better, we've got to go back to the first century and talk about what kind of marriages there were. Because in the church, there were people from all different kinds of marriages. You know, slaves were very prevalent in the Roman Empire, and there were slaves that had become followers of Jesus that were now sitting in church. And slaves weren't allowed to be married in the Roman Empire. Now, slaves were allowed to move in together, and they would be called, in a sense, married. It was called your tent companionship. If a slave owner gave permission for one of his slaves to move into a tent with someone else's slave because the two slaves had fallen in love, they would give permission and they would move in together and kind of be married, although there was no ceremony, and they would be called tent companions. But both of them knew at any moment the masters could sell them to someone else and rip that relationship apart and send them away. So that tent companionship relationship was very volatile in the sense that it could end at any moment. But they were considered married. So there were some people sitting in the Corinthian church that were slaves that had come to Jesus. And Paul is trying to talk about the importance of marriage, and they're wondering, well, am I really married? And as a tent companionship, does that honor God? What if this is my second or third one? Because my former tent companions have been sold to someone else in distant lands. Should I stay married to this person? Should I send them away? I want to be devoted to Jesus. So what should I do with my tent companion? The second kind of marriage was the common law marriage like we have today. But in the Roman Empire, you only had to stay together 1 year and then you were considered married. So their common law marriage was 1 year together, you're considered married. But now I want to follow Jesus. I wasn't actually really married. We just lived together for a year and became common law partners. So does God see that as pure? Should I divorce him? Should I marry him? What should I do, Paul? What should I do? The third kind of marriage is where dads could sell their daughters into marriage by requiring a dowry. And so that marriage wasn't really based on two young people falling in love with each other. It was based on who could give the biggest gift to dad. I kind of like this particular model. In fact, I tried it with our daughter. We have one daughter. When I took her to Kenya on a mission trip one time, I was offered 30 cows for her, and it was pretty tempting.